Good.
Thank you for joining Darien Library this afternoon for New York National Historic Sites, 7 Wonders to National Parks. This is the start of an 8-part series, and today's topic is Federal Hall. Allen Depres is a retired United States park ranger. He's been giving programs for the American and even the international public about the important issues of universal and American values of history found in our national parks and historic sites for over 20 years. As an interpreter of history at Weir Farm, the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island, the African Burial Ground, Grant's Tomb, Federal Hall, and Castle Clinton, Allen has lectured, given tours, and created programs for the general public as well as school groups. He's been busy. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. I hope everyone is ready to learn about the fascinating history of New York, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Allen, and he's going to get started. Thank you, Allen.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for coming. Today, we're going to talk about Federal Hall, and as we go along, it's obvious, I hope it is, that the whole history of the 18th and 19th century in New York is all interrelated. So Federal Hall is going to make some comments when we do Grant's Tomb, and Castle Clinton, the same thing. So you'll be seeing themes, and like at Federal Hall, I'm not going to be this one we're doing today. I'm not going to be talking about Alexander Hamilton and the Constitution and the federal government being in New York, or I would only talk about it very briefly. I would be talking more about that as we go along. And last week, someone asked about a question about parks being removed. I believe under the Antiquities Act, a president can set the land aside, and then the last president withdrew some properties, and President Biden has put them back. So I haven't been able to find out, though, if it's something that would be a normal practice, and you'd have to go to court if it was done, if it wasn't changed back. So I don't know. So far, I haven't been able to find out about that. So I hope that answered one of the questions that were asked last time. So Federal Hall, from Colonial City Hall to site of the first U.S. Capitol under the Constitution, and I say beyond because it had a purpose past the 18th century, as you will find out more as we go along. Okay, I thought I'd put this picture of the half moon along the skylight of Manhattan, and that is Battery Park, I believe, right down there. And there's the old pier, and of course the Dutch were the first European settlers, and we will talk more about them when we do the African burial ground as well. This is moving slowly. It's not working. What's going on? Are we frozen?
Is it just not moving forward?
It's not. I don't know what's going on.
Interesting. I would minimize your PowerPoint, and then let's see what we can do.
Okay, I'll do that.
Sorry, everyone. Thank you for your patience.
You know what it is? It's. I believe it's my computer. It's probably frozen, and it usually just lasts for a minute.
Okay.
So hopefully this will work, because I can't even make the screen less.
Thankfully, it's a beautiful image.
It's pretty good. And I guess I can talk without being prompted by the screen. Coming up, you're going to see some more pictures of Amsterdam, of New York under the Dutch. And of course, it was a very small population conquered by the British after the restoration of the monarchy in the 1660s, and it was conquered by the Duke of York, and so therefore it became New York City, named after him. So there we go. There we go. Now, a couple of images I'm going to talk about as we go along. You're going to see this big building again. It was the largest structure, probably in the colonies in the 18th century. But next to that, the stone wall is a milestone. I believe the original message on the discolored, the brick-colored stone there was 12 miles from New York. Federal Hall, as it looks today, and of course the Stock Exchange is just down the street. Statue of George Washington that was put in there in 1883 to commemorate the inauguration. Not quite exactly matching the time, but still the same idea. Okay, some of the important events that happened at Federal Hall. Site of the City Hall under the Dutch. Now, in 1699 to 1703, they built a new City Hall. The British did. So therefore, we'll see pictures of that. Interestingly enough, the City Hall under the Dutch was started out as a tavern. And in my research, it said that was pretty normal under the Dutch. So that I found rather interesting. Then it was important as the path to the Revolution, 1735 to 1775. That's when the feelings of the colonists began to change about Great Britain as their mother country, at least many. And then the Peter Zengel trial, and that was about freedom of the press. We'll learn more about that. The Stamp Act Congress was 1765, is the first time that the colonies got together to protest what the British were doing. So they met in New York City and developed a protest, which they sent to Great Britain. Now, during all this time, it was pretty much the headquarters of the British in North America. In fact, it was the main place where communications from the mother country, there was a special packet or boat that brought messages to the governor and the authorities in New York City, the British authorities. 1776, the Revolutionary War, the British occupy the city. We'll be talking about that a bit. Just let me tell you that they did burn it, or at least it looks that so, and not the George Washington or the American troops as they left. And then from 1785 to 89, it was the home of the Confederation Congress, or the Articles of Confederation. And then in 1789, the first United States Capitol Congress under the Constitution and the national capital of the United States. It only lasted for a little over a year, and we'll talk about that when we talk about Alexander Hamilton. First cabinet met there, and April 10th, 1789, President George Washington was inaugurated. The Bill of Rights were done there. The New York Stock Exchange was created in 1792. Or eventually evolved with a group of investors, merchants, etc., meeting under a tree, and national currency when Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury, New York Custom House, and New York Sub-Treasury in the 1860s. So it's had quite a career. This is the original City Hall under the Dutch. Again, I like these views, so I guess I have a couple of them. And there again, a picture of New Amsterdam under the Dutch, probably in the 1660s. Not a very large place, as you can see. Pardon me for stopping for a minute. My cat is here playing with the extension cord on the computer. So I'm sorry about that. Let's continue. And a view of New Amsterdam before the British took over. And again, this is still New Amsterdam, a different view. Now, after 1660, we get into the British colonial period. And there's a view, probably around 1730, of Manhattan under British. The place with the flag, I believe, is Fort George. Okay, and some of the importance of the colonial cities in the 18th century. Even though the colonies were overwhelmingly agricultural, and the Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston were small in comparison to the cities in Europe. And even Mexico City, which at the time had 100,000 people, when New York City had about 4,500. Now, it always was a port where wheat and corn and other products of the soil were to be sent to the West Indies. And it was a lucrative trade for New York and even Philadelphia, because the West Indies was the big slave sugar cane plantations, and that's all they grew. So they needed food, and that's what New York and Philadelphia and Charleston supplied them with. So as it says, they gathered colonial goods to the West Indies for the big slave colonies. Some of the populations by 1770, Philadelphia, 30,000 people, New York, only 25,000. So it was not the largest city at the time. Okay. Now, list some of the wars, King George's War, French and Indian Wars, Anglo-Spanish War, etc. Some overlap. And these were the wars that Great Britain fought with other European powers. And since they needed supplies, they needed wood to build ships, they needed colonial agricultural products, and also they sent about 25,000 troops during the 7 Years' War to New York City and Boston. So those troops had to be quartered. And of course, they spent money buying the products in New York, some made there, a lot of them also made in Great Britain. So it helped, those wars helped to make New York City very, very rich at the time. As Benjamin Franklin said, New York is growing immensely rich by money brought to it from all quarters for the pay and subsistence of the troops. And that Benjamin Franklin made that statement. And these are some of the laws that Great Britain had to protect their industries in England. So Parliament outlaws exportation of American hats, Molasses Act, merchants are prevented from trading with French West Indies. Only British ships from Great Britain could do that, and so on and so forth. A lot of these rules and regulations were not enforced for many, many years. That was going to be the problem after the French and Indian Wars, or what was called the 7 Years' War in Europe, when the British needed money. They needed to pay for the expenses of their empire and all of these wars that they had fought in. Some of them, they said, to protect the American colonies as well from the French and the Spanish. And so they started enforcing some of these laws, and they became very unpopular, and the colonies began to protest. This just tells you how the colonies grew, and also what was important to them. And in Great Britain, this was the time of the Industrial Revolution, so they were making many products that they wanted to sell. And New York, I believe, in the colonies was one of their biggest customers. So New York and northern ports, I put that in pink there. Economic growth had a lot to do with sugar production and trade because of the continuing lucrative sugar production in the West Indies. Demand for about 400,000 pounds worth of bread, flour, wheat, and livestock were exported every year to the West Indies, and that was from New York. So we had a lot of money or goods exchanged and a lot of lucrative trade. This is the British City Hall. I believe it was completed in 1703. Another view, I think this is almost the same picture. I brought this up here because this is from an archaeology site. This was a stone wall in the Battery in the colonial period, I think from the 1740s. And just down the road from Francis Tavern, you can walk along and see some of what was found when these diggings were done. And looking through that glass, you can see some of the pottery that the colonials would have used. Where that came from, I don't know if that was American products or British. And a cistern. Now, this privy was found by the present day City Hall. And here we go. These are the groups of people and looking down through the glass. And to the right, you see the pillars there, and that's the area we're talking about. These white lines demarcate some of the structures that were there. So you could take a walk, I think that's Pearl Street, right down around there, and take a look at all of this. Now, I show you this large structure, which you saw at the beginning. This is the Rhinelander Sugar House and Prison. Now, it wasn't a prison when it was first built. It was to refine the sugar, the raw sugar cane that came from the West Indies. So this was a lucrative business at the time, and this structure stayed up until 1892. Too bad they didn't keep it completely. And a powerful structure. Under present day directions, the sugar house stood at the southwest corner of Rose and Duane Street. So if you look at the corner, that's where it was. I said it was one of the largest buildings in pre-revolutionary New York. Massive stone structure as a sugar house, and that was used to refine the sugars produced by West Indian slave labor and put into those loaves of sugar and with other products and traded in the colonies and in England. View of New York Harbor, probably in the 1760s. And now these pictures of wharves, etc., sort of overlap. They might be a little later on, but it gives you an idea. This is early 1800s, but it gives you an idea what a busy place New York was even in the 18th century. So this was an early 1800s, I believe, a little later. And again, a large port with lots of ships. And here we go again. And here is a scene from the 18th century, a modern version of it, done probably in the 1920s. But anyway, here is someone trying to recruit a sailor, I believe. Now, in the 18th century was a big consumer revolution. And as I said, the colonists were the biggest customers in the colonies of Great Britain. And so in the 18th century, colonists were drawn into the Atlantic commerce. They were given loans by British merchants so that they could import these things. And of course, they had to pay them back. So, the American merchants made loans to the people of New York, who bought things like linens, metalware, pins, ribbons, glassware, ceramics, and clothing. So, New York was greatly in debt, and the rest of the colonies were something like 2 million pounds by the 1760s, which was a huge amount of money at the time. And Americans also made their own products. You'll see some of them. Some of them they weren't supposed to, but like I say, a lot of these regulations had not been enforced. And here's some of the imported British goods, and we have a nice set of dishes and grocers and tea dealers. You've heard of course, the Boston Tea Party, and a pewter plate. Here are some more things that you would get from Great Britain. I believe this is pewter again. Some earthenware glasses and bottles. And I believe to the right are hair products, combs, scissors, brushes. Now, this kind of wealthy goods here would have been what the elites bought in New York City and in the colonies. George Washington, when you read about him, he ordered clothes in Great Britain and he sent his measurements and they would do a suit of clothes for him. And so being a wealthy planter, George Washington was able to do that. these products most were not for the common people, the regular workers, tradesmen, sailors. Wallpaper to the left, a lovely a set of chinoiserie and a brocade, and above that, that to the right, the white background, I think that was more of a cotton material for clothing, so that doesn't belong with wallpaper. And more British goods, which is this bucket, a leather bucket, was used to carry water, jars, some cheaper to the right, to the bowl there, some cheaper blue willowware. Now, Franklin said, "He that hath a trade hath an estate." So we see some of the American products, and that would include artisans and craftsmen, furniture makers, silversmiths, jewelers for the wealthy, blacksmiths, weavers, coopers. Coopers are barrel builders, construction workers. An artisan would be in a small workshop. He owned his own tools. He worked at home, his family helped, but he also trained journeymen and apprentices that were learning the trade. So an artisan had some economic freedom, especially in good times when he was making a lot of money, enough to survive at least. So he was on a higher footing than the apprentices. They wanted to be able to own their own tools and have a place and a shop to make their products and sell them. Okay. More furniture for the wealthy. A furniture craftsman shop in the colonies. Now, Myers, bringing him up, 1723 to 1796, was a Jewish silversmith. And this is some of his products. Jewelry, candlesticks, gold and silver, tableware, coffee. He also did religious ornaments for churches and synagogues. He was wealthy enough to buy fairly large pieces of property in in New Hampshire and Connecticut as well. And you can see his work is just wonderful. A closer up view of some of them. Of course, these are the elites that he would have sold these to. And these are all people of quality of the 18th century. A baker's shop, and that's another one of the products, baking bread, shipbuilding, more shoes, weaving. Here's a cooper working in a shop. Coopers were the way to transport things like flour and other agricultural products, even nuts or whatever. So these were the containers of the 18th century in trade. They were very important. Here is a cooper working on one of the barrels. Of course, this is Phillipsburg Manor, and this would be a mill for grinding corn and wheat. You can visit Phillipsburg Manor today, quite a place. Also, the Phillipses owned slaves as well. I believe they had about 30 of them. Remember, New York was a slaveholding state in the 18th century. New York City, about a quarter of the population at times were enslaved. Okay, here's some corn growing there at Phillipsburg Manor. A typical colonial farm, and again another. Blacksmith, his shop again. And this is a tavern, Stonebridge Tavern, it says in the narrative there on the bottom, supposedly on Broadway and Canal Street in 1812. So that was pretty bucolic then. And a way to get around, more for the rich, I suppose, and not too far from the city, I believe, because most of the roads were pretty bad. And that's why if you could travel by boat along the coast or by river, that's the way you wanted to do it. Printing press, important, of course, in the colonies. They loved to read. There were tons of newspapers. And a lot of the apprentices, even craftsmen, workers, sailors, what have you, their families had a few books. They had tea. They had other products that were considered luxuries in the 17th century. By the 18th century, because of this consumer revolution, was a much different story. New York showing Fort George right there in the center, probably in the mid 18th century. Francis Tavern, a meeting place after the Revolutionary War for many of the delegates to the new Congress and members of the new government in the 1789, 1790s. Another view, probably late 18th century. And this is where, let's see, Francis Tavern is just up the road there to the right. So it's in that same area, Pearl Street, etc. Now, freedom of the press. This is a landmark case, and it's very important to freedom of the press in the United States, the future United States. And this was, there was a lot of politics going on in 18th century New York, surprise, surprise. And they were called Whigs, supposedly more liberal, but they were opposed to the governor, William Cosby. Let's turn that around. William Cosby was the Whig. The other politicians were Tories, as a matter of fact, and they didn't like him. And strangely enough, they riled up the masses of the town, as a matter of fact, against Cosby. Rather interesting. You think it would be the other way around. But he wrote an article, his newspaper did, and that newspaper was owned by the Tory group, that said that the governor was corrupt. And the New York Council, under the governor, ordered 4 issues of his paper burned, and they arrested Zenger and kept him in prison, I believe, for about a year. Brought him up for trial for seditious libel, and the judges instructed the jury that he printed the offending article and don't worry about whether it was true or not. That was illegal to do that. So he was attacking the governor, and we weren't supposed to do that, obviously. It was against the law, or so they said. So the wealthy supporters who owned the paper hired Zenger's attorney, and that was Andrew Hamilton, no relation to Alexander Hamilton. And he said the jury should not judge and say that it was against the law without finding out more about this. And he said the words against the governor, if they were true, then the jury should acquit him. You can't just say things that are you can't just say things that are true, should be libelous because it was true. And so they should acquit him. And his famous statement is that every man who prefers freedom to a life of slavery will bless you. He was found not guilty, and it showed that libel cases could be easily, worked on. And interestingly enough, if Zenger had attacked the assemblies were worse than the governor about if you printed things that were which they considered libelous. But anyway, the law of libel remained on the books, but the trial said the publication of truth should always be allowed, no matter what. So the colonists in New York and other places in the colonies were saying that freedom of expression was important, and freedom of the press. And of course, here's an artist's rendition of that trial, and a diorama here of the same. And the burning of the 4 issues of the paper. I put this in next because slavery, selling and buying of slaves, was a big business in the 18th century, especially. And here we have the slave market at the end of Wall Street. And so that was going on in the 17th and 18th century. Okay. Now, I listed some of the things from my research that said what the colonists liked about the empire. They didn't like the regulation of trade, but because they prospered from it, and also it wasn't enforced very much until the 1760s, so trade was important. Also, the British Navy protected their shipping. And the differences between the colonials and the English, especially with the elites, was not a big chasm because the elites emulated Great Britain, often buying clothes, products, educating their children there. So the colonials, at least the thinking ones, if you want to put it that way, very much admired the British system, or what they thought the British system was. And down here it says there was an international trade in ideas and goods across the Atlantic and beyond. So the things that talked about freedom, the British Constitution, liberty, the idea of liberty, no taxation without representation, the balance of government, that the king should be limited by parliament and the law, and a judicial system. All of those things were there. And the colonials said they had the rights of Englishmen. That's what they were fighting for, the rights of Englishmen, all those things, and also the right to vote. Though about most of the population of Great Britain could not vote, there was a big difference between Great Britain and the colonies in that. I think about 2/3 of colonial males could vote. So that was a huge difference, and they wanted a say in their government. They also read the newspapers. There were, Benjamin Franklin started libraries, and a lot of the customers of those libraries were working men. So it was a interesting world at the time, and a lot of colonials thought that they were protected under those rights of the Englishmen. And I really just talked about that. And of course, according to Eric Foner, the brilliant American historian, British colonies included thousands of the freest individuals in the Western world. Those not included, of course, were the permanent enslaved or Native Americans, and of course, women, though they were to have a lot of say in the revolution. If you look into it, I can't get into that now, but it's an interesting subject, especially if you look into New York, because a lot of the ladies grouped together and were quite radical in what they expected. Anyway, so it was interesting that the white colonists in America had the highest per capita income in the world. And of course, they had a high birth rate, long life expectancy, and expanding demand for consumer goods. And natural rights, popular sovereignty, constitutionalism, all of those things I just talked about. And they also were aware that the tendency of power was to encroach on liberty, to limit the right to vote, to limit the powers of the legislature, and civil rights to people. I don't know if they would call it civil rights at the time, but all of those things were important to how the colonials viewed the world. Now, I like this interesting spot here. Even though Great Britain had no class of the exploited and enslaved, as the Americans, the colonials did, though of course they were big in the slave trade, the British, 3/5 of the British population owned no property. In North America, 2/3 of freedmen owned their land, a huge difference. 18th century farm families saw their land as a right and as a necessity for freedom. That, of course, is what Thomas Jefferson would say as well, and always believed that. He was very much into America remaining an agrarian society. and more natural rights. I think I've gone over the most important ones. So we won't stop too long over this. And it more of the same. So all of these ideas were going around in America, and they came from Great Britain, since that was the biggest influence, obviously, in the colonies at the time. Now, what leads to revolution? After the 7 Years' War, I put that on the bottom. The last item is very important. The British said, we need money for the empire, so we're going to get some of it from the colonies. So all of these things, Navigation Act, Molasses Act, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, where you had to pay a tax on a newspaper, wills, books, etc. So that was a very engrossing tax that the colonists hated. Intolerable acts, of course, comes a bit later, just before the Revolution, where Great Britain closes the harbor of Boston because of the Boston Tea Party. Taxation without representation and the rights of Englishmen, all very important. And that tells you more of the same. This is a view of New York during the Stamp Act Congress, and you can see there's a little riot going on, and they're burning papers, or they're burning the stamps that when that fee was paid or was put on that you had to pay for. That was one of the taxations most hated. Here, of course, we have what it all led to, Declaration of Independence. And there we have a picture of the Continental Congress. Now, when the war started, the battles in Boston, Bunker Hill, etc. The British, once that was done, that was put under control, they wanted to take New York. And of course, Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence, all of those things had happened or were going to happen. I believe in the summer of 1776, that was when, of course, the Declaration of Independence was signed. And that Declaration of Independence was read to the American troops in New York City, because Washington had brought his army there after Boston, keeps his army intact. General Howe abandoned Boston and attacks New York in the summer of 1776. George Washington leads his army to defend New York, marches to Brooklyn, Battle of Brooklyn Heights. Howe pushes the Americans back, and they have to evacuate New York City. The picture here is the British landing off Long Island. About 10,000 troops, I believe, something like that. And 100 ships brought them from Great Britain. He was able to flee with most of his army intact, to New Jersey. So it says he left 3,000 men at Fort Washington, and they were captured by General Howe. That was George Washington's headquarters in New York, one place, Old Kennedy House headquarters. And this is the Joomla Mansion. As they had to move north with his army, this Joomla Mansion was occupied by George Washington. I think it was Morris, and Morris were the first owners, and then other owners, Joomla. This was George Washington's bedroom in that house, and you could see this today. This is uptown in Harlem, and it's quite a trip. I remember going there quite a few years ago. And again, George Washington's bedroom and office. Now, what I'm going to show you next is the Great Fire of New York. And the British occupied New York. of great fire started. Some said that the colonial army set the fire. Others said it was the British. Others said it was an accident. There are eyewitness reports at the time that said they saw people setting fires. And so whoever did it, about 25% of the city was destroyed. And then many of the houses that weren't destroyed by the fire were looted. New York, because so many fled, went from a population of 25,000 in 1776 to 5,000, and pretty much stayed that way until, of course, they had refugees and some of the enslaved fleeing to try to get their freedom, because the British had promised to do that. So it was a big deal at the time. And when the Americans won, that, of course, is an example of some of the damage. This is the prison ship, and also the sugar structure, that the large building that refined sugar that I had mentioned before. That was a big prison, turned into a big prison in Manhattan under the British. Okay, now this is George Washington riding into New York and liberating it in 1783. I don't think New York would have looked too much like that, because most of the damage hadn't been fixed. So it would have been quite a bleak place at the time. But so this might be a bit romanticized. And on evacuation day, you can see this gentleman climbing up and putting the flag up. The British, as they retreated and left, actually it was said that they greased the pole. So it was hard to get the flag up there. They were being rather spiteful. But according to this print, they did it. Anyway, I thought this was kind of interesting. 13 toasts that a banquet held did on evacuation day. And one is, to His Most Christian Majesty. I assume that they were being sarcastic. They include through in the King of Sweden, the American Army, fleets and armies of France, the memory of those heroes who have fallen for our freedom, vindicators of the rights of mankind. These were all toasts. You had a little sip of wine. By the time you were finished, you would have been pretty well, shall we say, overcome with a little drunkenness, perhaps. And from 1785, really to 1789, though, the New York was the headquarters of the Confederation Congress under the Articles of Confederation. And big problems with that. The war was over, and a lot of, shall we say, infighting, differences between the colonies in trade, etc. And it was a weak central government, and it couldn't pay its bills because it didn't have the power to tax. It could declare war, conduct foreign affairs, but each state had one vote. It could coin money, but it couldn't tax anybody. The only way it could get the money was by the largesse of the states. They would make a contribution. And lots of times they would promise and never did it. A couple of accomplishments, though: the land ordinances of 1784, 1785, and 1787. And the most important thing about that was the territories would become future states. So they weren't a shall we say, continuous unfree unfree area governed by a federal government. States would join the Union. And that was a very important thing with that Northwest Ordinance Act and some of these other ones. It wasn't going to say that it was just the original colonies and they were going to own everything else. And don't forget, Virginia, New York, Connecticut made all these land claims to the West. Some of them went way to the Pacific, though I don't think too many had seen the Pacific. So that was one of the problems that was going on, what to do with the territories. Yeah, the Constitutional Convention, Constitution and ratification. This is one of the parades celebrating the New York voting to join the new government. That ship was called the Hamilton. That's something I have to look into further. I don't know if that was, it doesn't look like it was a really, shall we say, a sailing vessel, or it looked almost like if they built just to do this parade. Also, the Society of Tutorers, I thought that was rather interesting. They were one of the groups, craftsmen, tradesmen, etc., joined the parade with banners saying that we're happy to be in this new government. Now, rules to knit a nation together, federal government and not a federation, 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. Remember, that's one of the things that came from Great Britain. It wasn't quite the same, but the idea of a balanced government, each branch making sure the other didn't become too powerful. They also had the new government, new nation had, according to the Constitution, could regulate commerce between the states, the power of tax, and most of the people wanted a Bill of Rights. And that was not part of the original Constitution, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, and so on. That was done under the auspices of Alexander Hamilton, who really didn't want to do it. He said that was protected, or protected enough in the Constitution. But some of the states, like New York, who ratified the Constitution, said that would be part of the deal. We had to have a Bill of Rights. Oops, sorry. All right, this barge is George Washington coming across from New Jersey, I believe. And white-robed choir of young girls were to greet him. And this was called a magnificent state barge. It was at Elizabethtown. It was rowed by 13 white uniformed sailors, symbolizing the 13 colonies. Inauguration day was clear. There was a cannon salute from Fort George. Soldiers in Highland uniforms and playing bagpipes. The president was very much surprised, or he shouldn't have been, that he got such a greeting. Metal buttons of George Washington's coat had embossed eagles on them. And so it was quite a celebration in this parade leading to his swearing in as the first president of the United States. Inauguration day, the city was decorated with colored lamps, transparencies. Those were paintings, and lights were placed behind them, and they were hung up in front of buildings, etc., with lanterns behind them, so you would get a picture like this as it shone through the lights, shone through the canvas. And a lot of citizens placed candles in the windows to show their appreciation. So these 18th century transparency scenes were painted on translucent paper or lightweight cloth, silk, linen, calico, or muslin, with lights so that you can see this scene. So that was one of the things that were done, especially at night after the inauguration. City Hall was converted into the Capitol building. Pierre L'Enfant, who designed the layout for Washington, D.C., and you saw the picture of the City Hall under the British. There's quite a difference here. This is the floor plan with the House of Representatives and the Senate chamber below. The carriage was loaned by a wealthy family to George Washington I believe the streets were too crowded, so he did not use it to go to the inauguration. There's a rendition of how it might have looked. Francis Tavern, of course, was a meeting place at this time for the congressmen and senators and officials of the government. And also, I believe the owner had helped during the revolutions, sending secrets to the Americans about some of the British plan. Interior in some of the rooms as you see it today. Now, this is a total recreation of the original tavern. Here again is one of the rooms, and you can go in and see them. They have a museum and also a restaurant. Another view of his George Washington's inauguration. There's another one in color. And the Bible. No one could find a Bible. There wasn't one there. So they were able to borrow one from, what are they called? We would call them the Masons. There was a Mason headquarter down the road. And so they loaned the government this Bible. And this is the Bible that George Washington put his hand on. His inaugural address and his writing there, as you can see, in his own hand. The 1883 statue, a recreation of some of the soldiers, and of course a school group climbing up to go in to take a look at Federal Hall. The Federal Hall again, another view. The President's Mansion, which is no longer there. There is a plaque that says this is the spot that this house was occupied on from April 23rd, 1789 to February 23rd, 1790, as the presidential mansion. Now the street scene, early 1800s. I see that tavern again. This map was made of New York as a future plan of how it should look. This was done in the 1790s, I believe. Now into the 19th century, which we'll go through quickly as possible. Grange Terrace, I believe this was designed and influenced by a group of buildings in Bath in England. I believe that's the remnants of them. That I believe was built in the 1820s. So New York in the 19th century. That's Gracie, that's City Hall, excuse me, not Gracie Mansion. And that, of course, I believe that was built around 1812. Now, what happened to the old City Hall? It came this. It's this Ithiel Town, I believe that's his first name, and Alexander Jackson Davis are the gentlemen who designed this. Now, this is in the early American Republic. So this was 1840, 42, when it was built in a classical style. The government was showing off. It was showing off its prosperity, that the federal government was working. We had come through the War of 1812. We had been getting richer and trading with ourselves and with Europe. And so the Custom House would have been very important to get revenues for the new government. And so it had to be a showplace. And so this became the showplace, or one of them, for the federal government. Classical style was very much in vogue for much of the 19th century, because the democracies of Greece and the early Roman Republic, all done in that classical style of gods and goddesses and Ionic and columns and grand open spaces and domes, etc. All of that was saying that the American Republic was much influenced by the ideas of those past republics in ancient times. And the founding fathers very much admired what they thought were the constitutions in ancient Rome and the direct democracy in Greece. So that it was very important to show that style around to the world. New York Custom House. This, as I say, was constructed in 1842. Now, the custom duties collected, and this is quite a statistic, accounted for 70% of the entire revenue of the federal government in those days, before income tax was known. So this was a very important place. There were, of course, other custom houses in other cities, but New York was the richest port throughout the 19th century. And another view, this looks like around the 1840s, 1850s. The interior today walking in through those large columns there and down the hall, which would lead to this open space. And actually, this is where the customs officials did their job. And so it's quite a place, as you can see. In the present day, they have exhibitions there and special programs. When you visit Federal Hall, you can get a tour. You'll see the original Bible that George Washington used, and also a lot of other interesting artifacts. Now, in the 1860s, the Custom House became the New York Sub-Treasury. So the Custom House moved to another site. And this is where currency was put into circulation. Government paid, bills were collected and paid. Much of the public financing of the nation's industrial and commercial development in the 18th and 19th century originated here. So quite a interesting place. That's the safe. And this is, you can go downstairs and see this. This is where they kept the gold and the money, and in support of paper money and also coin as well. So we were under the gold standard, obviously. So it's an interesting place to take a look at. Obviously, those bags aren't filled with gold today. There we go, counting the money, getting the revenues in there. So the currency was supported with the gold. I don't know what these people are doing in here, but maybe tourists came in to take a look. I'm not sure. But anyway, that is the Sub-Treasury building, and it looks like there are a couple of tourists that are walking around with a candle. So I can't explain that one. The famous statue of George Washington by John Quincy Adam Ward, put up in 1883. You could see the ceremony. Unfortunately, it rained that day. Interior, when this was still the Sub-Treasury, probably in the early 1900s. And another view from the outside. And I believe we're coming to the end. George Washington, and there under George Washington is the dome. And there's the 12 miles from New York that I was showing you at the beginning, between 211th Street and 212th Street. Any questions?
That was a lot of information.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, do not apologize. I'm just still processing everything.
I know it's hard. I should try to streamline it a bit.
I don't see any questions. Let's see. We'll give it a few moments. So just as a reminder, we're going to meet again, same time, same place. And what's our topic, Alan, next week?
That's the African burial ground.
Correct.
Which would also talk about the New Amsterdam and enslavement in New York in the 18th century. So it's I hope people will find it interesting and turn it.
I'm sure they will. It looks like you've answered everyone's questions.
Well,
you were pretty thorough.
I hope they didn't all fall asleep. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, what can I say?
Oh,
if there are any suggestions, I'd be glad to hear them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we have a pretty extensive, oh, here we go. It says in the early slide that was green area of the building. I guess what was the building in the early slide that had a green area, or what is the green area maybe?
A green area. I'm not sure. Is it a large structure? Was it the sugar refinery plant? Had greenery around it.
Is there a
way that might be the Joomla Mansion, the white structure, which is one that was taken over for a while by George Washington as his headquarters.
What was it called again?
The Joomla Mansion. Morris Joomla Mansion, I believe. The builder was Morris, and later on, a lady bought the house after they sold it. So that mansion was built in the 18th century. It was a very wealthy family. And as you can see, George Washington had two places as his headquarters, and that was the last one before they had to evacuate.
Oh, they responded, it was behind the Bowery. It was surrounded by large buildings.
Behind the Bowery. And it was green. That might have been Battery Park, the park where George Washington, not George Washington, sorry, George, that the statue of George III was pulled down when the revolution started. Maybe that's it. That was a park and there's a small remnant of it there as well today, which has the bull for Wall Street on it, the big bull. If you've been down there, so it might be that park. And there in that park, or originally, as it looked, was the statue of King George III.
Okay.
And after the Declaration of Independence was read, I believe, the crowd went down and tore it down. And there's a long involved history of where the head went here and the arm went there or whatever it was. So I have it somewhere in my notes, but that might be what they're talking about.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, you can always email me and I can send them to Alan and he can answer them for next week as well.
That would
So
be
you have options. So if you lose any sleep tonight because you're like, oh man, I should have asked Alan that question, I can take care of it.
Yes, I'll do the best I can. Now, one of the things before you go, I could have slowed down because, as you see, there are several themes there. There's the colonial period, there's the Revolutionary War period, and there's also the early capital of the United States and all the important things that were done there. So what I'm saying is that I could have just emphasized one or two of those things, because those themes are what the site is all about. Mm-hmm. And all of the sites have several courses or strands you could follow. So if anybody has any suggestion about maybe emphasizing something more and dropping a few other things, I'd be glad to hear it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
No, you're welcome.
Well, this has been delightful. Thank you for educating us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care. You too.
Bye.